I'm Jonathan Koffman, I'm a senior lecturer here, and I want to indulge you in an area that's fascinated me over the last couple of years or so. I want you just give you a little bit of film to begin with to get you in the flavour of what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll show a bit of film at the end. This is Woody Allen, and he's talking about a film that he's just about to release, but the journalist is more interested in understanding Allen's take on happiness, which is going to be difficult and interesting. I'll stop there. Try and contextualise what Allen's saying in relation to what I'm going to be talking about as this presentation unfolds. What I want to do over the course of the next half an hour or so is to explore with you the concept of happiness, slippery as it is, and the architecture of this very interesting concept, what it is, what it isn't, focusing back on a little bit of philosophy just to raise the bar a bit. I want to explore with you whether there's any evidence that there's value added from being happy, and particularly at the end of life where there's pretty spartan evidence, pretty little research has bothered to explore this really fascinating topic. And then with your help, I want to reflect on what this all means in the clinical encounter. So can you all hear me? Is that all right?
Move the mic a little nearer.
Just a little bit, okay. So at first glance, happiness seems to be a little bit like love. If you ask yourself whether you're in it or not, you probably aren't. We rarely care to define it, but by heaven we know when we see it. So what is happiness? It's a subjective, fuzzy, vague feeling. It's been ignored by psychology until fairly recently, which frustrates me because the 1985 Oxford Dictionary of Psychology went from haploid to haptic without any signs of regret. And they only focused about 3 lines on hedonic tones. So it's possible that psychologists weren't particularly interested in this really interesting topic, and I'm not convinced by that. In the early days of psychology, they were challenged by a kind of lack of a theoretical vocabulary to make sense of this concept. And by the time they'd found their feet, they were so interested in measuring eye blinking than love and joy and happiness. So they weren't particularly interested in connecting up these fascinating concepts with eye blinking, for example. But things have moved on tremendously since then. So we've now got a growing movement on hedonics and positive psychology. There are thousands upon thousands of references to psychology on PubMed or Medline and Psychlit. And in recent history, we've had a really interesting new journal, which I recommend. It's called the Journal of Happiness Studies. So read it on the loo, and smile occasionally because it's got some fascinating insights into the human condition. Again, I want you to indulge me. I just want to give you a few seconds to think about what you think happiness is to you. And then I want to give you a little bit of a moment to make a mental list of things that make you happy. And I want you to reflect very carefully on why you chose them. Sometimes people don't think about these really central issues. I want you to think carefully whether you've ever asked anyone else what makes them happy, and then narrowing down to the clinical encounter, have you ever asked a patient what makes him or her happy and why? So I'll give you a moment to think about that. We'll feedback later on and hold those thoughts, particularly as this presentation travels over the next several minutes. Okay? All right then. Happiness has got a long and glorious history. You'll be aware of Bentham. This chap here is in a box at University College up in North London, around Gower Street. And he suggests that the best society is one where its citizens are happiest. So the best public policy, I think government needs to bear in mind of this, is one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And when it comes to our private behaviours, and I need to bear this in mind myself, he said our right moral action is where we aim to produce the most happiness for the people who we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And this is essentially what Bentham refers to as the greatest happiness principle. It's fundamentally egalitarian because everyone's happiness is equal. So that groundwork done, what exactly is happiness? It belongs to a class of concepts which draw on examples that appear to be fairly related to one another. So many languages draw the distinction between joy and pleasure, the kind of immediate take on happiness, and then something far more long-lasting, far more permanent, in relation to satisfaction and contentment. If we look at different languages across the world, there's a specific lexical link between different words which relate to happiness. So, for example, good luck, particularly if we go to the German language, Gluck and Glücklich, I'm getting my pronunciation awfully wrong here, help me out someone. And then in England, we used to say good hap, which means good luck, essentially. So there's something about happiness and its family that has something to do with things turning out better than we expect. Now, the actual concept of happiness is really quite slippery. And that doesn't negate its value. It's been defined as the degree to which an individual evaluates his or her life as being positive. So contemporary theories of happiness draw on this, and they refer particularly back to Aristotle's notions of hedonic and eudaimonic happiness. Happiness from the hedonistic point of view principally focus on the pleasure-pain principle, where pleasurable experiences are there in relation to sensory gratification, and hopefully they override negative sensory experiences which are by definition harmful to us. And if we move to the kind of notion of eudaimonia, this is about the actualization of individuals' potential in terms of fulfilling their daimon or their true self. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more as the presentation goes on. So many perspectives on happiness are consistent with eudaimonia. For example, according to Waterman, happiness is maximised when people's life activities coincide with their most deeply held values. And this results in what he refers to as authenticity, aliveness, and something else that he's very interested in, which is personal expressiveness. And if you go to the literature developed by Rees and Keyes, they start suggesting that these eudaimomic concepts of happiness are akin to autonomy, to environmental mastery, and positive relationships with others. But the common denominator between these different schools of thought around eudaimonia are that the pursuit of pleasure in its own right isn't enough to keep us going in terms of actualising our true identity. It's about building our own strengths and our own virtues. So, I need you to help me here. What makes you happy? That's me. I'm happiest when I'm surrounded by family, but also cycling, and cycling very fast, dangerously fast. What makes you happy? Throw things out at me. You've had a few moments to think.
My dog.
Your dog. Okay, that's great. Anything else?
Grandchildren.
Family, grandchildren, yeah?
Small successes.
Sorry? Small successes. Well, I suppose that's relative. Okay. Anything else?
Big successes.
Big successes may be commensurate with larger amounts of happiness. Come on.
Walking in the woods.
Walking in the woods. Okay.
Travel.
Travel.
Fish and chips.
Now that's akin to kind of hedonistic happiness, the pleasure-pain principle, isn't it? Okay. You may be surprised by the findings of this piece of work, which is Daniel Kahneman's work, which I think is really fascinating. So what he did was he asked 909 women across Texas to tell him how they spent the previous day and how they experienced those different kind of activities. No one mentioned sex in this room, which is interesting. And what he did was, to recruit these women, he got them to divide up the day into episodes, to report what they were doing during those episodes, what they were doing with, and very importantly, how they rated those episodes in relation to happiness derived. So you can see here that sex or intimate relationships was how they refer to it in the literature, was the thing which they spent very little time doing, but derived an enormous amount of pleasure from. And commuting, they spend a long time doing it and they're not happy doing it at all. I don't know how you can combine those two. Maybe there are laws about that. And they're a really gregarious lot. So in the next line, you can see that they prefer the company of others compared to being alone, but they prefer to be alone rather than being with their boss. So I need to be wary of that. So with that work done, what about the relationship between money and happiness? And I think it was Alan who said that money's better than poverty, if only for financial reasons. There's not a lot of link between how deep your pockets are and how happy you are. It's a very interesting literature. So let's get on to the pursuit of happiness, understanding or the search for it. And if you've not read this, I think this is required reading. It's a book by Michael Frayn called A Landing on the Sun, and it's about the British Prime Minister who's asked one of his trusted advisors, one of his trusted civil servants, to go out to look into happiness so his servant could come back and inform government on how that they could pursue happiness in policy and make the populations better. But the search for it proved so elusive that he went mad and died. Despite this fable, politicians aren't as gloomy as Michael Frayn, and the prospect of knowing about what makes us happy has been central to governments over the last several years. They substitute happiness with the compound term well-being or general well-being. And David Cameron's taken this on over the last several years, and he's been trying to understand this concept in the light of rolling back the shores of the welfare state and many, many cuts in terms of services and spiralling living costs in order to work out what's going on. So at the Google Zeitgeist European conference several years ago, Cameron said this: "It's time that we admitted that there's more to life than money. It's time that we focused on GWT, or general well-being. Well-being can't be measured by money or traded in markets. It's about beauty, it's about surroundings, it's about the quality of our culture, and above all, the strength of our relationships and improving society's sense of well-being, I believe, is a central challenge of our time." There's nothing new here. This is a little bit like the Emperor's New Clothes, because somebody who inspired me during my teenage years, a chap called John Maynard Keynes, talked about it in 1930 in relation to the art of life. And then Bobby Kennedy comes along in the 60s and says that we can't measure national spirit via the Dow Jones average, nor national achievement by the gross domestic product. With that said, the Office of National Statistics has compiled what we refer to as a happiness index, they refer to as measuring national well-being, and what they're trying to do is to understand the architecture, the structure of happiness in British society in order to potentially inform policy. I'm not convinced they're there yet. So the function of happiness, what's it all about? Why be happy? And I think this is a really interesting issue in relation to what it's all about. I've persuaded you that happiness is politically expedient, but that alone doesn't make it supremely important. It's important because I think it's hardwired within all of us. It's part of our overall motivational device. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but in the meantime, we seek to feel good and avoid pain for very important reasons, because without it, human beings probably would have perished a millennia ago. For what makes us good, pleasure and sex and good friendship and self-esteem is good for survival, and what's painful, what's unhappy in our lives is bad for survival. So we try and steer clear of all those different activities. We do smoke, we do drink. It gives us an element of pleasure that's ultimately contradictory in relation to what I'm saying. But the search for happiness is something that I think has preserved us for as long as it has. So most sustained forms of happiness are good for you. They're good for your physical and mental health. All other things being equal, and happy people tend to have more robust immune systems, and they tend to have lower levels of stress causing cortisol. And a little bit more evidence here comes from a fascinating study that was carried out by a very interesting chap, Kahneman, a few years ago, where he suggested that happiness or quality of life may have very, very long-lasting effects on our well-being and our longevity. So when he took 750 people who'd been nominated for Oscars, he tried to understand which of those folk had won and which of those folk were just merely nominated. And what we get here is a very, very interesting take on this, that those who won Oscars, on average, tend to live 4 years longer than their peers who were merely nominated. And he suggested in the text that once you get an Oscar, it gives you an inner sense of peace and accomplishment that seems to last your entire life. So I don't know if the fate of these true here. This is Jennifer Lawrence tripping up. She's got to be careful. And this is Jessica Chastain. Now, she won, and she was merely nominated. They both look rudely well at the moment. We'll see what life does to them. So given the centrality of happiness, it's surprising. I mean, I was surprised how literature actually focused on this in relation to end-of-life encounters. and the meanings and its presence at a point of time, a critical moment in time, where there seems to be quite a few opportunities where we might wish to think how we can inject moments of happiness into a landscape which is sometimes bleak and dreadful. Where the research has been conducted, it's focused on healthcare professionals' perspectives on the constituent elements of hope, and similarly abstractly in relation to examining possible differences in the scope of end-of-life decision-making and attitudes towards advanced directives. So a good friend of ours here, a chap called Raymond Volz in Cologne, surveyed 159 patients across 3 countries and identified that participants' negative emotions, which included sadness and hopelessness, were far more common than happiness in shaping important future decisions about their illness and their circumstances. And then we get on to Jessica Temmel's really interesting study where she randomly assigned patients with newly diagnosed metastatic small cell lung cancer to receive early palliative care alongside their regular oncology treatment and compared the outcomes of those individuals with those who were just receiving best standard care. And what she demonstrated was that palliative care enhances quality of life, which may include that magical ingredient called happiness. It reduced depressive symptoms and it extended life. Now this is open for debate whether happiness is part and parcel of that journey. I'm not sure, but to our knowledge, very, very few studies have bothered to examine the presence of meanings of happiness at this really critical juncture in people's lives. So we came along, and this wasn't central to our mixed method piece of work. This is a piece of work that I conducted with Irene Higginson, Reverend Dr. Peter Speck, Mifanwi Morgan and Polly Edmonds, several of my colleagues who developed a mixed method study to understand the interface between culture and the experience of living and dying from advanced cancer in South London. We recruited participants through the palliative care teams at Guy's and St Thomas's and King's here, and also recruited participants through the oncology and lung clinics in these 2 different organisations to try and capture people who weren't just in receipt of palliative care, to understand the broader piece of suffering and the experience of living and dying from this very interesting disease. Now on to the interviews. The interviews were fairly informal in style, and basically I went in and asked my participants to tell me in their own words what their disease or illness meant to them, to find meaning or to attribute meaning to what had happened to them, to make sense of the inexplicable. We asked our participants what bothered or troubled them about their illness, and they threw light on not only a shopping basket, but a shopping trolley of symptoms which were incredibly distressing, some of which were refractory and consumed them. And we asked our participants what helped them as their disease progressed. And what I tried to do was to raise the levity of what had been a very, very sad and depressing interview with many of participants. And I inserted a question towards the end of the interview to ask them in their own words what made them happy, and whether what made them happy had moved or changed as their illness had progressed. A little bit about the analysis here. We adopted a framework approach. We scrutinised the interviews line by line. This was a rigorous process which took a very large section of my life to make sense of. It was a new territory for me, and I had to learn rapidly. And I had some superb mentors en route. But just backtracking in relation to how the work was conducted, because this was important for me, because Stanworth states in order to be open and sensitive to potentially important areas, I think researchers have to try and suspend conventional assumptions or expectations about the situations in front of them. I went in rather naively, thinking that cancer was the worst thing that these individuals had encountered. Counterintuitively, I had to listen beyond the words. And I had to separate myself from the idea or the notion that the experience of cancer and their impending death were the worst things that could happen to these folk. For quite a few of these individuals, cancer was catastrophic. It was carnage for them, but there were some individuals who moved me in an altogether different direction when they started to talk. They threw light on decades of marital abuse, which had been physical and mental. One individual called Jeannie told me fairly early on in the interview that she'd attempted to gas herself and that her husband had been brutal to her over a very, very long period of time. And then there was a woman called Becky who I think I'll remember for a great time, who was a young woman, about 34, with an adenocarcinoma and a vulvar fistula, and she was in the most awful pain. But what troubled her more was her long struggle with alcohol dependency, her depression, and the reality that her 6-year-old daughter had been removed from her care. This was bigger. This transcended the awfulness of her illness. And I'm driven to a very interesting quote by Longacre here, who suggests that usually when you listen to a statement, you hear it as a kind of echo of yourself. You're actually listening to your own opinion. And I needed to move beyond that, and that was difficult for me, because it bars you from actually hearing what participants are saying or what they may say. So there were opportunities where there were silences, where I stopped and waited for them to carry on. It was a very, very interesting journey for me. And then there was this whole notion of me being what Stanworth again refers to as being a reliable witness or a confidant. Quite a few of my participants were very sceptical about whether they were providing me with accounts which were reasonable, accounts that I wanted to hear. They challenged their ability to provide me with an eloquent account on their distress and suffering and how they were making sense of this important moment in their lives. This again is Becky. She asked me if she sounds sick, does she sound mad in the head? And I questioned that. And I said, absolutely not at all. She provided me with a very evocative account of how her illness was falling out. So now onto the data, and this is where it becomes interesting. What we see here is that quite a few participants in both ethnic groups are very willing, I wouldn't say happy, to provide me with accounts of meaning and the meanings of happiness in relation to their lives and how they make sense of this particular emotion. And the range of meanings evolved, and they included empty lives, a theme which was associated with lives devoid of contentment, happiness in the physical form, particularly in relation to the presence of this shopping basket of distressing physical symptoms. The third one was around love and belonging, which was central to both ethnic groups and frequently associated with family and friends. I think Peter threw light on that. And then realising personal meaning in life, and this element of happiness was associated typically with making a connection with God, one's deity, belief systems, finding sense through biblical narrative and connecting with a sacred world. And this was more common amongst my Black Caribbean participants than their white peers. So let's get on to this. The first theme is around sad, empty lives. And these were accounts were associated with, sometimes many participants referred to positive dimensions of health, but there were a few folk who preferred instead to talk about lives devoid of any contentment at all at this really decisive moment in their lives. And it hurt to listen to these. I'll be fairly brutal and honest. It was quite shattering to hear some of these accounts. So, for example, a 63-year-old Black Caribbean woman with cancer in the site unknown felt really quite unable to consider any circumstances where she could be happy in a setting, this was a hospital setting, where all control over events had been completely suspended. And she said, it's a really hard question you're asking me, because at this moment in time, I haven't got any enjoyment at all. I just watched the day go by. But there were other participants who reflected on the question in much broader terms and spoke of the happiness, not just within the context of their cancer, but in relation to the long-term corrosive psychosocial suffering that they preceded their diagnosis and continued to define who they were. And I think this is best illustrated by this woman here called Beatrice. She's a 45-year-old white British woman with metastatic breast cancer. And she considered my question. She was silent for a few moments, and then she carefully reflected on the acute pressure to locate moments of contentment in the remaining time allotted to her. I'll give you a moment to read that. I think this represents a state which is quite inaccessible to pharmacology. And Peter Strang, who's written very, very eloquently about this, would suggest that this involves sensitive discussion around these refractory concerns, which provides some scope, he suggests, for healing wounds in a deeper way. I don't know if she told everyone this, or whether it just arose at that particular moment in time, but it was a shattered life, there was very little time to undo this, and she died very shortly after we transcribed the interview. 7 Black Caribbean and 1 British participant referred to the physical dimension of their health and happiness, and quite a few aphorisms grew out of this. At one end, this meaning was associated with a kind of unrepentant pleasure, closely associated with the kind of hedonistic apparel of happiness. And this is illustrated by this chap called Sherwin, an older Caribbean gentleman with lung cancer, who spoke about the palpable recollections of contentment associated with summer sun. It's really easy to relate to this. I'm happiest when the sun shines on my body, but many folk referred instead to the glass half full, this shopping basket of symptoms which depleted them of any opportunity to be happy. And it's at this point they refer to poor appetite, to fatigue, to psychological problems, to fungating wounds and so on. But it was pain in particular associated with their cancer and its progression that many participants quickly wanted to narrow down on. They provided me with really evocative insights into the consequence of this symptom, and this is a chap called John, a 70-year-old white British gentleman with lung cancer, who explained the relentless experience of his stomach pain, which divided him of any moments of pain. And he said, "It's worse when I get up in the morning, just before I go to the toilet, like you get this horrible pain here, a sort of tightness around here. I have trouble in my stomach." And then there was a long silence. "Before I had this, I used to do a lot of laughing and joking. I was always joking about, but since I've had this, I'm bad-tempered, I get the hump, I don't know what's happening." This may be an interesting moment. Then we move on to love and affection, and this refers to the place and importance of emotional connectedness that our participants shared with significant others. It was a theme associated with 7 Black Caribbean and 7 white participants at a time in their lives where the diagnosis of cancer and its projection evoked a range of really interesting emotional responses. For example, fear and anxiety, a lot of anger, a lot of depression, a lot of helplessness, and a lot of despair. It was also a time marked by transitions, a state of apparently good health to increasing reliance on others in fulfilling the most basic of daily activities of living. It was a time when participants were hungry, ravenous, to draw on the emotional support of family and friends to affirm their continued meaning and value in their lives, around their marked bodily changes and their considerable loss in vitality. And they spoke of the perceived safety of being surrounded by family and friends. Happiness is contagious here, who offered a welcome distraction from the consuming agenda of their illness, particularly as they moved through the different stages towards the end of life. So this is a really wonderful Black Caribbean woman, and she suggested that her family and friends and close friends were instrumental in moving her outside that zone of depression, anxiety, to a much happier and enjoyable place. And she said, "My family and friends are really supportive. They're the people I can talk to and have a natter with. They don't pretend to understand what's going on. They obviously can't. They're just there for me, and that makes me happy." This is a woman who I suppose was incarcerated in the hospital ward. But it was Stella, this 88-year-old white British woman with a gastrointestinal cancer, who provides I think, a much more powerful, evocative account of how the absence of her children, particularly her grandchildren, severely compromised her ability to be happy in a place where the cadence and the pace of life changed dramatically. Her life was caught short here. She gets very distressed at this point, and she just wants to tell me how important her grandchildren are to her, and how, for that moment, that day and the preceding days, her grandchildren were just physically unable to come up because they were unwell. And that was corrosive in terms of diminishing her opportunity to witness their happiness and for that contagion to come her direction. The last theme is around connection and transcendence at the edge of life. And this was a theme which was populated principally by Black Caribbean participants and a very, very small smattering of white participants. And this was related to religious faith and belief and the interface between happiness as an emotional state. And the avenue to happiness here took the form of prayer, making connection with their deity and accessing support through very, very developed social connections through church communities and churches themselves. So here an 88 white British woman with breast cancer chose to share some really interesting sentiments to help me understand how miserable her husband was and how she'd resorted to religion to move her to a much better place. And she said, when I asked her what makes you happy, she said, well, I suppose my religion, because I haven't had my husband around very much. He's been a right old moaner all his life. And I said, a right what? A moaner, miserable and bad-tempered, you know, and I've had to put up with it. All 7 Black Caribbean participants spoke of their deeply held religious belief as a means of comprehending the inexplicable, making sense of very distressing symptoms, and helping them cope with the journey from the point of diagnosis right up to a point where they were just physically unable to convey to me what was going on. And this is illustrated by a very interesting 66-year-old Black Caribbean man. And he talks about God. I say, what makes you happy? Yeah, belief in God, because I said sometimes when I wake up in the morning and the way I feel and the way I pray to God, and you think to yourself, am I going to stay like this all the days of my life? Am I going to feel like this all the days of my life? And you feel different. You feel strong, you feel happy, and you feel happy in your mind. We believe these eudaimonia go back to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia as coming from within. These accounts of happiness are closely correspond with contemporary theories of happiness born out from the positive psychologist movement. And there's a very important thinker here called Cicely, and what he developed was a theory of flow of well-being, which involves a state that occurs when individuals are so deeply absorbed in a demanding or an intrinsically motivating challenge that the world drops away around them. All their concerns disappear and they focus on the here and now around that particular task. And I suppose with these individuals it was around prayer and making a connection, a very close connection with their deity. This resulted in a sense of loss of time and an elevation of their self which distanced them from the here and now and the distress associated with their physical disease. And here there's a chap called Jack, an 82 Black Caribbean gentleman living with prostate cancer, who went one stage further when he conveyed to me how his cancer experience was something that he embraced, rather than being perceived as a source of burden that he'd rather not live with. In this sense, the experience of cancer and dying from cancer were considered worthy of his spiritual investment. And he believed his cancer offered him a really interesting entry into a more fulfilling and richer existence than his mortal existence on earth. To him, this was the essence of his happiness. So, we hypothesise that the accommodation of distressing symptoms, some of which are culturally shaped in patterns, in the way that people articulate attributions to their symptoms, may enable some participants, particularly our Black Caribbean participants, to straddle some of the physical distress associated with their cancer pain. And we observe this position far more frequently amongst our Black Caribbean folk than the white British participants we interviewed. This is really interesting, and it's in stark contrast with Kathy Sharmaz's work around predominantly white American females who had heart disease, who had cancer and multiple sclerosis, when she says the language of suffering of severely debilitated people spoke of was a language of loss. They seldom talked about gaining a heightened consciousness of the world or revelations of self and insight into human nature from their experiences. Our Black Caribbean folk are not in this position. They are altogether somewhere else. And I'm reminded by George Eliot's Adam Bede here when, well, it's she rather than he being George Eliot, when he writes, deep unspeakable suffering may well be called a baptism, a regeneration, an initiation into a new state. Some of our Caribbean folk have reformatted the notion of happiness to put themselves in an altogether different place. So its relevance to the clinical counter and its relevance to the clinical counter at the end of life is interesting, particularly where Martin Seligman, who's at the forefront of the positive psychology movement, has questioned the suggestion that investigating positive emotions, for example happiness, is luxurious. it's an indulgent goal. And again, I question that as well. And also the questioning that there may be different levels of happiness, an agenda, a route map to take you from one dimension of happiness to the next. I think happiness is important. I think we've got some very palpable accounts where it has added value. We have some very palpable and very evocative accounts where the absence of happiness is corrosive. These are undoable moments. And back to the order bit, this is controversial here, particularly when I started thinking about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of need that many of you are probably really familiar with. You know that he developed this very interesting pyramid or hierarchy in relation to happiness and self-actualization and true being. And the essence of the hierarchy stipulates that we have to encounter and manage lower order needs, for example, physical dimensions of need, shelter, food, sex, and so on. And as we manage those and fulfill those needs, we can work our way up the hierarchy to get to a point of what Maslow refers to as self-actualization and meeting that moment of self-esteem. And I can see implications here for the clinical encounter at the end of life. I think it has a certain charm, but I think its linear approach needs to be challenged. It has deficiencies, particularly in relation to some of the folk that we interviewed. We can see that some participants that we interviewed were compromised, particularly in relation to physical symptoms that eroded opportunities to be happy. So it would be reasonable to walk down the road of impeccable assessment and timely intervention and try desperately hard to diminish the distress associated with pain and vomiting and nausea and depression. But at the same time, we can see from our data that culture, this so-called recipe for living in the world, may to some extent influence the currency of some of these levels of happiness or need that Maslow paints out for us. So, for example, connectedness with others, or moving towards the top of the hierarchy, self-actualization, were the things which were far more central to some of our participants, even those who were experiencing refractory pain. This was where I think clinical efforts need to hone down on, focus and manage better. Maslow refers to the final theme of self-actualization as becoming more and more of what one idiosyncratically is. And this fits well, I hope I get this right, Cicely Saunders' description of the goal of a patient as being him or herself at the end of life. And a little bit more of Cicely. She said way back in the 1960s that I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. You know about total pain. The reality that pain doesn't just exist in neural pathways. It's everywhere within us. She talks about it being physical, psychological, social, emotional and spiritual. It predates the whole notion of impeccable assessment, which is hardwired into the WHO definition of palliative care. And critically, it's tied to a sense of narrative and biography and speaking and then reflecting to patients in front of you with, I think, what she refers to as an authentic curiosity. So there's a recommendation here, but I think sometimes we need the time and presence to understand the architecture of who the patients are in front of us and how happiness can be understood and articulated, and then to devise strategies to focus on the levels which are pertinent and relevant to that patient at that point in time. And I also think that we need to be sensitive and willing to identify the verbal and the non-verbal cues that patients from all cultures present to us at this really critical moment, and to better understand how we can get to a point where we know who they are, maximising and then building on moments of joy. I'll take you back to Michael Frayn right at the very beginning when he threw light on the reality that one of his trusted civil servants, well, the search for happiness has so eluded him that he'd gone mad and died. And Michael Frayn suggests that the idea of happiness is surely like the sun at the centre of our conceptual planetary system, but it proves very, very difficult to look at directly. I think we need to look at the sun occasionally and to try and understand the architecture of who our patients are and the families who surround them to identify these really critical gems that we can capitalise on. One more bit of film here. This is completely different to Woody Allen, and it will be good. I'll leave it there.
Find that within.
I don't pretend to have all the answers to any of your questions, but I really welcome anything you have to say, because it's an area that's fascinated myself and Irene and Peter and Polly and my family over the last several years. Thank you very much for your time.